Welcome to a journey through the moments that left an indelible mark on human history. Events that changed the world and continue to shape our present. Join me as we discover together how time has woven the great stories that still echo today. The construction and legacy of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Beneath the unwavering sun of the desert, along the generous banks of a once more abundant Nile, rose a dream sculpted in stone. A whisper meant to defy the ages and reach us across the abyss of time. The Great Pyramid of Giza was never merely a construction. It was a statement, a declaration of power, of faith, of a profound understanding of the mysteries that govern the universe. Over 4,500 years ago, when the world was still young and maps were no more than hopeful guesses, thousands of men devoted their lives, their breath, and their strength to building something that still today challenges the limits of human imagination. The construction of the Great Pyramid, attributed to Pharaoh Khufu, cannot be understood simply as an act of architecture. It was a ritual, a profound merging of religion, science, and politics in ways we can barely grasp now. Each stone block, some weighing several tons, was carved with a precision that feels almost mystical and transported under conditions we find nearly unimaginable. The techniques used remain the subject of lively debate. Some imagine massive ramps stretching across the desert sands. Others propose lost methods of engineering far more sophisticated. What is undeniable, however, is the final result. A structure so perfectly aligned with the cardinal points that even modern instruments would struggle to surpass its precision. In those distant times, life and death were not opposing forces but twin reflections of a single reality. The pharaoh, revered as a living god, needed a worthy passage into the next world, and the pyramid was his vessel, his cosmic ladder. Every stone placed was a silent prayer, a promise of eternity. There was no modern notion of public works or common benefit. The entire kingdom moved not out of personal gain but from a conviction that in serving their king, they were safeguarding their place in the cosmic order. The fascination with the Great Pyramid lies not only in its size, its majesty, or its defiance of time, but in the fusion of knowledge it represents. The astronomical expertise needed to orient it, the mathematical prowess to calculate its perfect proportions, the immense social organization to coordinate tens of thousands of workers toward a unified goal. Through those anonymous builders, humanity showed that it could transcend its immediate limitations and reach toward the divine, not with their hands but with their will. The mysterious inner corridors, the hidden chambers, the slanting passageways and enigmatic shafts have fueled countless theories. People have spoken of secret rooms, cosmic alignments, even of lost knowledge that anticipated modern physics. While many of these ideas belong more to the realm of speculation than science, it is undeniable that something extraordinary hums beneath those stones, a heart of centuries that has never ceased to beat. The legacy of the Great Pyramid extends far beyond ancient Egypt. For centuries, it stood as the tallest man-made structure in the world, a record that remained unbroken until the Middle Ages. It inspired not just architects and engineers but philosophers, thinkers, and mystics alike. Its triangular form, reaching into the sky, has been interpreted as a symbol of ascension, of wisdom, of the bridge between the earthly and the divine. Even today, a mere glimpse of it evokes awe, stirring a sense of wonder that few other human creations can rival. Modern visitors often describe an emotion difficult to articulate when standing before it. A mixture of smallness and belonging, of amazement and an almost primal nostalgia for something they have never lived yet somehow recognize. For though it was built for a single man, the pyramid now belongs to all of humanity. Regardless of era, culture, or belief, its symbolic power transcends all boundaries, reminding us that we are capable of creating beauty that outlives its makers. The human story behind the construction must not be overlooked. The old myth that it was built by slaves has been dismantled. Today we know that the workers were highly skilled laborers, well-fed and organized with meticulous care into teams and shifts. They were individuals who found not just sustenance but purpose in their toil. To build the pyramid was to participate in something greater than oneself, to anchor their existence to an endeavor that would endure beyond their names and lifetimes. It is moving to imagine their faces, their sweat under the burning sun, their rough hands pulling stone, their voices singing into the desert wind. In ancient Egypt, the line between the visible and invisible was thin. Every action, no matter how mundane, carried religious and cosmic significance. Thus, the Great Pyramid was not merely a tomb. It was a microcosm, a terrestrial mirror of celestial order, an attempt to crystallize in stone the immutable laws that ruled the heavens. Its dimensions reflect sacred proportions. Its orientation captures the secrets of the stars. It was, in its deepest essence, a bridge between worlds. As the millennia passed, dynasties crumbled, cities were swallowed by sand, languages evolved, religions shifted, but the pyramid endured. It became an object of looting, of scholarly pursuit, of renewed fascination. It is said that Napoleon Bonaparte, during his Egyptian campaign, spent a night within its chambers, emerging pale and silent about what he had witnessed. Whether fact or legend, few monuments have the power to confront us so directly with our own impermanence and, at the same time, with our capacity for transcendence. Today, beneath the same relentless sun, the Great Pyramid still stands. It has survived earthquakes, wars, plunder, and the slow erosion of memory. In its shadow, generations have sought answers, projected dreams, found inspiration. It is not merely a relic. It is a testament, an eternal whisper that reminds us, even under the harshest conditions, we can achieve greatness if our purpose is high enough, if our vision is wide enough, if our will is strong enough. When we gaze upon the Great Pyramid of Giza, we are not merely looking at a monument of the past. We are staring into the face of human ambition, the eternal quest for meaning, the need to leave behind a mark that defies the erosion of time. Ultimately, it is an act of hope carved in stone, the hope that our works, our ideas, our passions might outlive the short span of our days. And as the desert winds continue to kiss its worn flanks, and the stars persist in aligning above its invisible apex, the Great Pyramid murmurs to us in a language only the heart understands. Eternity is not a distant realm. It is something we may have already touched. The fall of the Roman Empire. Somewhere across the vastness of Europe, under gray skies and over lands scarred by centuries, echoed the final whispers of a world that once believed itself eternal. Rome, that city forged through conquest and vows, of laws etched in stone and gods carved in marble, slowly witnessed the unraveling of the empire that had once cast its shadow over the known world. It was not a sudden collapse, not a loud catastrophe, but rather a slow, creeping decline, a persistent erosion, like water wearing down stone, drop by drop, until it turns into dust. At its height, the Roman Empire had unified peoples separated by language, by tradition, by dreams alien to one another. It had built roads linking oceans to valleys, erected aqueducts that brought life to dry lands, imposed a notion of order where chaos had reigned before. But the weight of such grandeur carried within it the seed of its own downfall. As the frontiers expanded and legions marched ever farther into unknown lands, the distance between the center and the peripheries grew too wide, and the bonds that once held the empire together began to fray, first imperceptibly, then with agonizing clarity. The causes of Rome's fall are numerous and complex, woven together into a tapestry as intricate as history itself. Corruption ate away at institutions from within. Officials who were supposed to serve the people began serving only themselves. The economy, once vibrant and thriving, grew fragile, strangled by unbearable taxes, devalued currency, and an agriculture that could no longer feed the swelling cities. Public morality, that intangible force that sustains empires beyond their armies, began to evaporate. Urban life, once the pride and motor of Roman civilization, decayed into abandonment, and with it faded the very essence of what it meant to be Roman. Meanwhile, on the empire's borders, new threats were taking shape. The so-called barbarians, whom Rome had long despised as wild and chaotic, were transforming into formidable foes. They were not mindless hordes but entire nations, driven by hunger, fear, and ambition, seeking in the heart of the empire what their homelands could no longer provide. Goths, Vandals, Huns, names that would echo through the chronicles of the coming centuries, laden with dread. They did not destroy Rome with a single blow. Rather, They were like waves, relentless and patient, wearing down even the mightiest fortress. The sack of Rome in 410 AD by Alaric, king of the Visigoths, marked a watershed moment. Although the city would survive, the myth of its invincibility had been shattered. Rome, the eternal city, had been humiliated, and that symbolic wound would never fully heal. Still, the empire struggled on for a few more decades, like a wounded giant refusing to fall, rallying its last reserves against inevitable decline. It was not until 476, with the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, that a definitive end could be declared, though even then, few contemporaries realized that an entire world had come to an end. Curiously, Rome did not truly disappear. It was not swept away like a drawing on sand before the tide. Instead of utter collapse, there occurred a deep and complex transformation. Roman structures, Roman laws, Roman language and art seeped into the new kingdoms that rose from its ruins. Latin evolved but did not die. The roads continued to connect faraway lands. Roman ideas of citizenship, of law, of governance continued to shape Europe's soul. Rome was not destroyed. It transmuted, threading itself invisibly through the future, becoming the hidden skeleton of a new civilization. In this transformation lies perhaps the greatest legacy of Rome, the ability to sow seeds of the future even in the moment of its fall. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, found fertile ground amid the empire's decay to expand and consolidate its presence. Bishops replaced senators. Cathedrals grew where forums once stood. The cross rose where once legions' standards had fluttered. The church, heir and reformer of the Roman spirit, became the new pillar of Western culture, ensuring that, in one form or another, Rome continued to govern the world. At the fringes of the former empire, new powers began to form slowly. The Germanic kingdoms, blending barbarian traditions with Roman heritage, gave the first shape to medieval Europe. At the courts of the Franks and Visigoths, Roman laws were still cited, ancient emperors were remembered, manuscripts were preserved that would, centuries later, ignite the fires of the Renaissance. Even those who had taken Rome's glory could not, or would not, completely shed its influence. The fall of Rome is also a warning, written in stone and blood. It teaches that no human institution, no matter how magnificent, is immune to internal decay, to arrogance, to the forgetting of its founding principles. It reminds us that the true strength of a civilization does not reside only in its walls or its armies, but in the vitality of its institutions, in the justice of its laws, in the cohesion of its society. When these pillars crumble, no army can save it, no wealth can preserve it. And yet, there is something deeply moving about how Rome refused to die completely. In the ruins of the Forum, in the cracked stones of the Colosseum, in the scattered fragments of law and dreams that still weave through modern culture, one can feel the echo of a quiet resistance. Like a flame smoldering under the ashes, Rome continued to burn in memory, in language, in the aspirations of those who came after. The end of the Western Roman Empire was not, ultimately, an absolute end but a metamorphosis. Like a river changing its course yet continuing to flow, Rome abandoned its imperial form and dispersed into countless new currents. From its ashes arose the medieval kingdoms, canon law, the Romance languages, the very idea of Europe as a collective project. Rome died, yes, but it also sowed the seeds of what was yet to come. Its fall did not signify the nightfall of civilization, but rather the threshold of a new dawn. More uncertain, more complex, but richer for it. And so, when today we walk among the ruins, when we read the inscriptions that time failed to erase, when we unknowingly repeat words born in Latin, we are witnesses to a silent miracle. The survival of a civilization that, though fallen, was never truly defeated. The rise and influence of the Byzantine Empire. While the West struggled amid ruins and darkness, across the Mediterranean, in the radiant city of Constantinople, a new chapter of human history was being written. The Byzantine Empire, direct heir to Rome's legacy, emerged not as a mere shadow of the past, but as a living, vibrant force, capable of reinventing ancient glories under new forms, preserving the flame of civilization at a time when the winds of barbarism threatened to extinguish it forever. Founded by Constantine in the 4th century upon the ruins of ancient Byzantium, Constantinople rose as a promise of eternity, a bridge between East and West, between the classical world and the one yet to be born. With its colossal walls, marble squares, and gleaming domes, the city was not merely a capital. It was a symbol, a beating heart of culture, faith, and power. Under Byzantine rule, Roman tradition did not merely survive. It transformed. Law, administration, architecture, and art flourished in new directions, adapting to the challenges of a changing world. The Byzantine emperors, adorned in gold and purple, no longer ruled in the name of a dying senate but under divine authority, as absolute sovereigns whose mandate came directly from God. In them, the human and the sacred, the temporal and the eternal, merged into a synthesis that permeated every aspect of imperial life. Of all the emperors who sat upon Constantinople's throne, few left a mark as profound as Justinian I. His ambitions knew no limits. He aspired to restore the empire to its ancient greatness, to reconquer lost provinces, to cleanse the law, and to erect monuments that would withstand the onslaught of centuries. Under his rule, Byzantium experienced a golden age that would shine as a beacon for generations. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the monumental codification of Roman law that Justinian commissioned, became one of the empire's most enduring legacies. Within its pages, the legal soul of Rome was preserved, organized, clarified, and handed down to a world desperate for order amid chaos. Centuries later, this body of law would form the foundation of modern European legal systems, proving that the echo of Byzantium would resonate long after its walls had crumbled. But if law was Justinian's intellectual legacy, the Hagia Sophia was his spiritual and artistic masterpiece. Built at the heart of Constantinople, this cathedral defied gravity and human comprehension. Its floating dome, like a captured piece of sky, symbolized the union of the earthly and the divine. For centuries, travelers and pilgrims would stand awestruck before its magnificence, describing it not simply as a building, but as a mystical experience. Hagia Sophia was not just the center of Eastern Christianity. It was a tangible testament to humanity's ability to transcend its own condition through art and faith. Byzantine influence extended far beyond its borders. From the deserts of Syria to the snowy fields of Russia, its culture spread like an invisible breath, carrying with it the art of mosaics, the tradition of iconography, the Orthodox liturgy, and the concept of a theocratic state. In the north, Slavic peoples embraced the Orthodox faith and, with it, vast swaths of Byzantine heritage, forging a cultural bond that would endure even after the empire's fall. The Byzantine Empire also mastered the art of survival in a hostile world through diplomacy. Where other kingdoms relied solely on the sword, Byzantium wove networks of alliances, manipulated adversaries, and used intrigue as a second nature. Its diplomats, astute and subtle, managed to preserve Constantinople's independence against seemingly insurmountable threats for centuries. It was a game of mirrors and nuance, where survival was often won more with words than with weapons. In everyday life, Byzantium shone in its singularity. Society was saturated with rituals and symbols, and court protocol resembled a liturgical dance, meticulously crafted to reinforce the sacred nature of imperial authority. The people lived with an intense religiosity, perceiving the fate of the city and of the world itself as intertwined with the favor of God and the purity of their faith. Byzantine art, with its strict symbolism and hieratic style, shunned naturalistic representations of the human body in favor of the spiritual, the eternal. Icons were not mere images but windows into the divine, sacred bridges to a higher reality. Painted with devotion and prayer, venerated in churches and homes alike, they were an integral part of the people's emotional and spiritual life. Despite its grandeur, Byzantium was not immune to crises. Internal struggles, theological disputes, and unrelenting external assaults slowly sapped its vitality. At times, its own achievements seemed to weigh heavily upon it, as though the burden of its heritage was too great to bear forever. Yet each time it seemed on the brink of extinction, Byzantium found new ways to renew itself, to adapt, to survive. The Great Schism of 1054, which definitively separated the Eastern and Western churches, marked one of the most painful chapters in its history. The division was not merely religious, it was cultural, political, and spiritual. From that moment on, Byzantium found itself increasingly isolated, a lonely bastion of orthodoxy surrounded by a sea of Latin and Islamic powers. The Fourth Crusade of 1204 dealt the most devastating blow. It was not Turks, nor Arabs, but Western Christians who sacked Constantinople, driven by greed and the corruption of a once noble cause. The city was ravaged, its treasures scattered, its spirit deeply wounded. Though the empire would be restored decades later, it would never again attain its former glory. In 1453, the inevitable came to pass. Sultan Mehmed II, young and determined, led the Ottomans in the final assault. For weeks the ancient walls held firm, but eventually they fell. The last Christian liturgy in Hagia Sophia was interrupted by the clash of conquest, and the dream of Byzantium was extinguished in a storm of iron and fire. Yet, like Rome before it, Byzantium did not truly die. Scholars fleeing westward carried its ideas and wisdom with them, sowing the seeds for the Renaissance. Its theology continued to shape Orthodox Christianity. Its vision of the state influenced future empires. Its memory inspired generations of thinkers and dreamers. The Byzantine Empire was far more than a belated echo of Rome. It was a distinct and unique civilization, one that built a luminous bridge between the ancient and modern worlds. And though its name has vanished from the maps, Byzantium lives on in every golden mosaic, in every dome rising heavenward, in every chant that echoes through Orthodox liturgies, reminding us that true greatness often lies not in conquering the world, but in preserving the soul of humanity through the ages. The Black Death. In the 14th century, like a malevolent whisper swelling into an unstoppable scream, the Black Death swept across Europe, tearing apart the fabric of civilization with a ferocity no prior generation had ever known. Emerging from the distant reaches of Asia, traveling on the backs of caravans and merchant ships, the disease found in the filthy, overcrowded medieval cities the perfect stage to unfold its macabre dance. No one, neither the mighty nor the humble, escaped its icy embrace, and within just a few years, a third, perhaps even half, of Europe's population was consumed by an invisible enemy. The plague did not strike evenly or predictably. It appeared suddenly in a port or an isolated village, like a storm without warning, and within days, the streets were filled with corpses, the markets shuttered, the churches deserted, and even the air itself seemed thick with death. Fear became a tangible presence, as real as the disease itself, warping behavior, dissolving family bonds, sowing distrust where once there had been community. Fathers abandoned their children, brothers refused to bury their dead, and in the dark corners of the cities, superstition wove monstrous tales to explain a horror that defied human comprehension. The medicine of the time, still trapped in theories of humors and divine punishment, was powerless against the brutality of the plague. Incense was burned on street corners, amulets were worn, endless prayers were muttered. Yet death continued its relentless march, indifferent to pleas and remedies. The doctors, cloaked in black robes and wearing beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, were more symbols of despair than hope. Each day, the creaking of carts carrying the dead echoed through the narrow alleys, announcing the toll of a war without armies, without battles, only silent, overwhelming defeat. The Black Death was more than an epidemic. It was a social cataclysm, an event that shook the very foundations of medieval life. Humanity's relationship with death, with God, with authority, changed irreversibly. The belief in a divinely ordered world began to fracture when it became evident that neither kings nor popes could shield their people from the fury of the disease. Mass suffering drove some to extreme asceticism, whipping themselves in penitential processions through deserted cities. Others surrendered to hedonism, living each day as if it were their last, because often it was. The economic consequences were equally devastating. With millions dead, fields lay fallow, workshops were abandoned, and trade came to a standstill. The shortage of labor caused wages to rise dramatically, undermining the feudal structures that had bound peasants to their lords for centuries. The material value of human life increased, planting the seeds for social changes that would slowly unfold over the following centuries. The plague respected neither borders nor creeds. From Constantinople to London, from Cairo to Paris, its dark shadow erased cultural distinctions, flattened hierarchies, and reminded all of the essential fragility of human existence. Yet, its impact was not one of destruction alone. Out of the wreckage of tragedy emerged new creative impulses, new ways of thinking and feeling. Art, for example, became imbued with a sharper awareness of life's fleeting nature. Frescoes depicting danse macabre, images of skeletons leading the living to their graves, reflected not only fear but a grim acceptance of a shared destiny. Literature, too, found in the plague a stage to explore the limits of the human soul. Works like Boccaccio's Decameron, born amid the plague-stricken streets of Florence, are not merely tales of love and wit. They are vital responses to the omnipresence of death. Through storytelling, humor, and desire, the characters cling to life, to beauty, to everything that the disease seemed determined to strip away. The collective trauma left in the plague's wake also altered the vision of the future. The certainties of established order, the stability of institutions, the benevolence of divine providence, all were shaken, replaced by a sense of vulnerability and uncertainty. This shift, subtle but profound, would become one of the invisible forces fueling the Renaissance, a rebirth of earthly values and human reason against the backdrop of an unpredictable universe. The Black Death taught humanity that neither wealth, nor knowledge, nor piety could shield it from the untamed forces of nature. It revealed that life could be swept away in an instant, that history is not always a steady ascent toward progress, but often a series of fractures, regressions, and trials. And in this bitter lesson, a new form of resilience, of boldness, of creativity was forged. In time, the plague receded, like all storms, leaving behind both visible and invisible scars. It would take more than a century for Europe's population to recover numerically, but the psychological and cultural impact of the catastrophe lingered far longer. Humanity's understanding of itself, of the bonds that unite us, of our essential precariousness, was forever marked by the memory of those years of horror. It would not be the last time humanity faced devastating epidemics. Yet the Black Death, in scale, in cruelty, and in historical significance, holds a unique place in collective memory. It is the dark mirror into which every generation, knowingly or not, gazes during times of crisis, searching for answers, for meaning, for reasons to persevere. Perhaps, ultimately, the greatest legacy of the plague was not death but life itself. The unbreakable impulse of human beings to rebuild, to love, to create, even when everything seemed lost. Through that abyss of suffering, humanity did not merely survive. It learned to reinvent itself, to understand its vulnerability, and to transform it, mysteriously, into a source of renewed strength. Today, when we look upon the cathedrals, the manuscripts, the songs that outlived the plague, we do not merely see remnants of an ancient world. We see the tangible evidence that even in the darkest hours, the spark of life is not easily extinguished. And in that spark, faint but persistent, lies the promise that as long as there are men and women who remember, who tell stories, who dream, no catastrophe, no matter how terrible, will ever fully erase the trace of our humanity. The Magna Carta. In 1215, in a meadow called Runnymede by the quiet waters of the Thames, a document was signed whose echo would resound through the centuries, beyond kingdoms, wars, and revolutions. The Magna Carta, initially conceived as an urgent solution to a political conflict between an authoritarian monarch and his disgruntled barons, soon transcended its immediate context to become one of the foundational pillars of modern ideas of liberty, law, and the limitation of absolute power. Early 13th century England was a boiling cauldron of tensions. King John, known less than affectionately as John Lackland, bore the weight of humiliating defeats, oppressive fiscal policies, and arbitrary legal practices that had incited the wrath of not only the barons but also the church and the common people. His unrelenting need for money to finance lost wars and his disregard for traditional legal customs sparked a rebellion fueled by accumulated grievances. What followed was not a popular uprising, not yet a democratic revolution, but a forced agreement among elites. a nobility demanding guarantees against the arbitrary rule of the crown. The signing of the Magna Carta was no voluntary act of royal greatness, but the product of pressure, military threat, and acute political necessity. Yet within its structure of concessions and protections lay a powerful seed. The idea that power could not be absolute, that even the sovereign must be subject to the law, that a higher order existed beyond individual will. In its original 63 clauses, the Magna Carta dealt with practical matters: rights of succession, debts to Jewish moneylenders, freedoms of the church, protections for merchants. It was not yet a declaration of universal human rights. But hidden between its lines was a revolutionary principle. No one, not even the king, is above the law. This simple statement, monumental in its consequences, would become the guiding thread of centuries of constitutional thought and political struggle. The most famous clause, number 39, established that no free man could be arrested or punished except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. In those few words lay the first steps toward what would eventually become habeas corpus, the right to a fair trial, the right to a defense, and protection against arbitrary imprisonment. Although free man at the time excluded most of the population, peasants, serfs, women, the concept planted the seeds of individual rights that would later expand to include all humanity. The Magna Carta did not immediately resolve England's problems. John denounced it as soon as he could, and civil war soon followed. The document was reissued, revised, partially forgotten, then recovered and reinterpreted across the centuries. Its importance lay not in its immediate application, but in its persistence as a symbol, a precedent, a banner of power restrained and rights affirmed. Throughout the late Middle Ages, the Magna Carta was invoked repeatedly, not only by nobles but also by commoners, as a shield against the excesses of monarchs. It became a living document, a weapon for those who sought to hold rulers accountable. Especially in times of crisis, when the balance between government and governed teetered precariously, its spirit re-emerged to inspire and fortify. The Magna Carta's true renaissance came in early modern England. Jurists, parliamentarians, and political thinkers rediscovered it, elevating it as the wellspring of Parliament's rights against the crown, of civil liberties against autocracy. Sir Edward Coke, one of the towering jurists of the Elizabethan era, declared the Magna Carta a cornerstone of the English Constitution. He reinterpreted it not as a localized feudal agreement but as an eternal affirmation of the principle that power must be exercised according to law. This interpretation had profound consequences far beyond England's shores. In the British colonies of America, the ideals of the Magna Carta served as both inspiration and legal foundation for the demands for autonomy and justice that would culminate in the American Revolution. Documents like the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution carry within them the living spirit of that medieval charter signed by the Thames. Even today, the name Magna Carta resounds in political and legal discourse, not because it contains all the answers, nor because its clauses can be applied directly to modern society, but because it marks a founding moment. The recognition that power must be limited, that rulers are bound by laws greater than themselves. The beauty of the Magna Carta does not lie in its perfection. It was, in many ways, a flawed, imprecise document, but in its symbolic power. It stands for the understanding that freedom is not a gift from the powerful but a right that must be vigilantly defended and continually reclaimed. It reminds us that every advance in the history of law and liberty is the result of struggle, negotiation, and often, sacrifice. When we look back at that aged parchment, we do not merely see an agreement between a weakened king and rebellious barons. We see the quiet beginnings of a revolution, a declaration that even the most powerful must govern within limits. We recognize the first trace of a path that leads to modern democracies, to the separation of powers, to the idea that justice belongs not to the whims of rulers, but to the collective will expressed through law and ethics. The site of its signing, Runnymede, has become a place of memory, of reflection, of inspiration. Where once pride and determination clashed, monuments now stand to remind us of the enduring importance of liberty and the rule of law, not as relics of a dusty past, but as living commitments that must be renewed in every generation. In today's world, where threats to rights and human dignity persist under new and often subtle forms, the lesson of the Magna Carta remains profoundly relevant. It teaches us that rights are not preserved by passivity but by vigilant attention, that the achievements of the past survive only if courageously and consciously defended. Ultimately, the true legacy of the Magna Carta is not inscribed solely in its parchment clauses, but in every act that upholds the primacy of law over power, of justice over tyranny, of dignity over oppression. A quiet voice, born in a medieval clearing, still echoing across the ages, speaking to the heart of every free human being. The Renaissance. At some point, between the shadows of the Middle Ages and the first rays of the modern world, the human spirit seemed to recognize itself once more, as if awakening from a long and profound sleep. This awakening was neither sudden nor uniform. It was not a blinding flash that instantly dispelled all darkness, but rather a slow, hesitant dawn, where curiosity once again spread its wings, and the thirst for knowledge, for beauty, for expression began to saturate the air of cities and fields alike. This moment, unique and unrepeatable, was the Renaissance, a time when man looked at himself again, not as a lost and condemned being, but as a creature capable of creating, of understanding, of dreaming new worlds. The Renaissance was born in Italy, in the vibrant city-states of Florence, Venice, Milan, where trade, politics, and art intertwined into a tapestry as complex as it was brilliant. It was a world of powerful patrons, of bankers who became princes, of guilds that competed not only in wealth but in splendor. In this seething cauldron of ambition and dreams, artists, thinkers, and scientists found fertile ground to cultivate their genius, to break free from the limitations of the past, and to venture along paths never before trodden. The recovery of classical texts, long lost or neglected, played a crucial role. Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, ancient voices that, once rediscovered, breathed new life into the minds of the age. It was not merely about imitation but about dialogue, about surpassing, about reinventing the ancients. Thus was born humanism, not simply as an intellectual movement, but as a quiet revolution that placed man, with his reason, his sensitivity, and his dignity, at the center of the universe. In this new worldview, beauty ceased to be merely a fleeting reflection of divine order and became a legitimate aspiration of the human spirit. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo Buonarroti, Raphael, names that even today resonate as synonyms of artistic perfection. Leonardo, with his obsession to understand the inner workings of nature, was not just a sublime painter but also an anatomist, an engineer, a visionary. Michelangelo, with every strike of his chisel, seemed to tear life from stone, revealing not mere figures, but the very tension of the human soul trapped within matter. Raphael, with his infinite grace, elevated harmony and serenity to heights never before attained. Yet the Renaissance was not only about art. It was also science, exploration, philosophy. Nicholas Copernicus, in his revolutionary treatise, dared to displace the Earth from the center of the cosmos, challenging centuries of astronomical and theological dogma. Galileo Galilei, with his rudimentary yet powerful telescope, opened the heavens to direct observation, stripping them of myth and wrapping them once more in rational wonder. Andreas Vesalius uncovered the secrets of the human body. Paracelsus revolutionized medicine. Giordano Bruno dreamed of infinite worlds beyond the stars. The Renaissance was, at its core, an act of faith. Faith in human reason, in humanity's ability to comprehend, to model, to improve the universe. It was not blind faith, but conscious, aware of its own limits yet deeply confident in its possibilities. Against the medieval fear of error and divine punishment, the Renaissance proposed the courage to doubt, to question, to experiment, to correct. Architecture, too, found a new language during this time. Filippo Brunelleschi, in crowning Santa Maria del Fiore with its immense dome, not only solved a monumental technical challenge, but erected a tangible symbol of human ingenuity, defying gravity, inertia, and time itself. Leon Battista Alberti codified classical proportions into treatises that still inspire architects around the world. The idea of the ideal city, a reflection of a rational and aesthetic universal order, became a recurring dream in sketches and utopias. Music, that other form of invisible architecture, also flourished. The Flemish polyphonists, like Josquin de Prez, wove sonic tapestries of astounding richness, where every voice, every melodic line, conveyed deep emotional exploration and inner discovery. But the Renaissance was no paradise without shadows. Alongside its splendor arose tensions, conflicts, contradictions. The colonial expansion that carried Europe into distant continents brought with it not only discovery but violence, exploitation, and destruction. The ideal of human dignity coexisted with new forms of slavery. The exaltation of reason lived side by side with the persecution of those who dared to think too freely. Nevertheless, at its heart, the Renaissance embodied a promise that still speaks to us today. The promise that humanity, through its ingenuity, labor, and imagination, can transform its world, can erect beauty amidst chaos, can find meaning in the face of uncertainty. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century accelerated the spread of Renaissance ideas, multiplying and democratizing knowledge, placing it within reach of those who had long been condemned to ignorance. From monasteries and royal courts, learning leaped into cities and villages, preparing the ground for the intellectual, political, and scientific revolutions that would follow. Thus, like an ever-rising tide touching and transforming everything in its path, the Renaissance eventually spread beyond Italy, conquering France, Germany, England, and the Low Countries. Each region interpreted its ideals in its own way, composing a symphony of voices that, despite their differences, shared a common longing for rediscovery, expansion, and rebirth in the fullest sense of the word. Today, when we walk the corridors of museums, read the treatises of humanists, listen to the music that once resonated in cathedrals and palaces, we feel something more than aesthetic admiration. We feel a call, an invitation to remember that within each of us burns a spark capable of defying darkness, of bridging separated worlds, of building new cathedrals of the spirit amid ruins and fears. The Renaissance ultimately was far more than a historical period. It was an attitude, an affirmation of life against resignation, of courage against fatalism, of hope against despair. It was the still young yet firm voice of a humanity that, after centuries of silence, finally dared to say, "We are capable of understanding, of creating, of loving. We are capable of being reborn." The Age of Exploration. There was a moment in the history of humanity when the horizon ceased to be a barrier and became an irresistible invitation. It was a time when maps, still crowded with sea monsters and unknown lands, began to transform into promises of new routes, golden islands, and undiscovered empires. The oceans, vast and fearsome, stopped being mere boundaries and became bridges instead. This era, complex, ambitious, and often brutal, was the Age of Exploration, a period where curiosity, greed, fear, and wonder drove men to venture into the unknown, forever changing the face of the world. The Renaissance, with its renewed thirst for knowledge, had breathed new life into the European spirit. Yet it was not merely the pursuit of knowledge that filled the sails of caravels. It was also the hunger for wealth, the desire to find alternative trade routes to bypass ancient empires, the thirst for personal glory, and the mission to spread the Christian faith. Portugal and Spain, small kingdoms on the western edge of Europe, were the first to understand that the sea could be a path to greatness. While the Portuguese cautiously sailed along the African coast in search of a southern passage to the Indies, Spain, driven by the daring or reckless vision of Christopher Columbus, looked westward and plunged into the unknown. Columbus, firmly believing he could reach Asia by crossing the Atlantic, set sail with 3 fragile ships and more faith than certainty. When in 1492 he sighted land, not Asia, but a new continent, he sealed not only Europe's fate but that of all continents. From that moment on, maps were redrawn, routes multiplied, and history rushed into an irreversible process of encounters and collisions. The Portuguese, with explorers like Vasco da Gama, achieved the seemingly impossible, reaching India by sailing around Africa, opening direct access to the spices and riches of Asia. Magellan, on a journey he himself would not survive, completed the first circumnavigation of the globe, proving once and for all that the earth, though finite, was vast, and the oceans an unbroken web that connected all peoples. Yet not all that came from the Age of Exploration was heroic. European expansion brought conquest, slavery, and destruction. Entire civilizations, with their languages, gods, and knowledge, were erased or absorbed in the name of civilization, faith, or gold. Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, with a handful of men and a blend of cunning, violence, and disease, dismantled the grand Aztec and Inca empires, erecting on their ruins colonial societies marked by profound pain and complex cultural fusion. The exchanges triggered by these voyages were not only of territories or riches but also of crops, animals, diseases, and peoples. The so-called Columbian Exchange radically altered diets, economies, and demographies. Maize, potatoes, and cacao traveled from the Americas to Europe, while wheat, horses, and smallpox crossed the Atlantic in the other direction. Worlds that had evolved separately for millennia began to intertwine irreversibly. The Age of Exploration was also an era of myths. Explorers sought golden cities, fantastical passages, and fountains of eternal youth. Reality and fantasy blurred so much that maps recorded not only what had been seen but also what was fervently wished for. This fusion of empiricism and imagination, of pragmatism and delirium, reveals the deep ambiguity of the human spirit when faced with the unknown. In the port cities, in shipyards and taverns, there was a feverish sense of movement, a swirling atmosphere of mortal risk and immense opportunity. Merchants, sailors, pirates, missionaries, and adventurers wove a nascent global society, a tangled network of interests, passions, tragedies, and hopes that foreshadowed the interconnected world we live in today. Cartography advanced in giant leaps. New navigation tools like the compass and astrolabe allowed sailors to venture farther and to map their routes more accurately. Every expedition not only opened new markets and claimed new lands but was also an act of knowledge, an expansion of the known universe. Yet, at the heart of the Age of Exploration beat a profound paradox. While mankind expanded its horizons, it simultaneously reduced countless others to mere commodities. The transatlantic slave trade, born of this global expansion, is a deep scar whose pain still echoes today. The thirst for discovery and the lust for domination were intertwined, exposing both the greatness and the darkness of the human soul. The Age of Exploration did not merely change economies and geographies. It transformed mentalities. Europe ceased to see itself as the closed center of the universe and recognized itself as part of a vast, complex, interconnected world. Otherness, once a vague concept, acquired faces, voices, histories, though often met not with respect, but with violence and subjugation. Over time, colonial empires would grow, scientific voyages would multiply, and trade routes would become ever more sophisticated. Yet something fundamental had changed. The world would no longer consist of isolated patches of existence. Since the Age of Exploration, the fates of peoples have been inextricably entwined. Today, when we look at ancient maps, with their imprecise contours and fantastic beasts populating the edges, we do not merely see geographic errors. We see the visual representation of a longing, the restless human urge to gaze beyond the visible, to cross the boundaries of the known, to discover not only new lands but new possibilities of being. The Age of Exploration was ultimately a vast transformation, of landscapes, of cultures, of dreams. It was the first step of humanity into a modernity where even identity itself would become a matter of questioning, shifting, and reinvention. And although its consequences were often devastating and its shadows stretch into our present, the memory of its impulse, the drive to open horizons, to seek knowledge, to connect worlds, remains a living testimony that to be human is, perhaps, not only to inhabit a world but to dare, always, to rediscover it anew. The Protestant Reformation. At the beginning of the 16th century, in the very heart of Europe, a deep murmur began to echo through the stones of churches, across monastery cloisters, and down the corridors of universities. It was an ancient dissatisfaction, long contained, that was finally finding words, gestures, and form. It did not emerge from a desire to destroy everything, but from the need to purify, to correct, to return to a more essential, less embellished truth after centuries of power and wealth. Thus was born the Protestant Reformation, not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, unstoppable fire that, once lit, could never be fully extinguished. Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk of passionate temperament and restless conscience, was the spark that ignited this blaze. When he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg's castle church in 1517, he did not intend to fracture Christendom but to open an urgent theological debate, to denounce abuses like the sale of indulgences that had corrupted the purity of the gospel message. Yet in a Europe brimming with ambitious princes, rising political tensions, and a clergy both feared and discredited, his gesture quickly became a banner for rebellion. The matter of indulgences was only the surface of a much deeper crisis. At its heart, Luther's call was for every Christian's right to a direct relationship with God, without intermediaries, without unconditional submission to Rome's authority. Sola Scriptura, sola fide, sola gratia. Scripture alone as the source of truth, faith alone as the path to salvation, grace alone as the divine gift needed. These simple yet revolutionary principles stood as a direct challenge to centuries of tradition, hierarchy, and ritual. The invention of the printing press just decades earlier played a crucial role in the explosive spread of reformist ideas. What might once have remained a cloistered scholarly debate now became a flood of pamphlets, books, treatises, and songs. The printed word became both weapon and refuge, the vehicle by which the new ideas reached villages, marketplaces, and humble homes alike. The Bible, translated into vernacular languages, was no longer a privilege reserved for a scholarly elite. It became spiritual nourishment for the common people. The Reformation was not a monolithic movement. Alongside Luther, other voices arose, sometimes allied, sometimes at odds. Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich, John Calvin in Geneva, and later John Knox in Scotland interpreted and adapted the reformist impulse according to their own theological and social visions. Where Luther maintained many elements of traditional liturgy, Calvin envisaged a stricter, more rational church deeply committed to moral rigor. Soon, religious wars tore through Europe, revealing that faith, once tied to power, could both liberate and destroy. Yet to reduce the Reformation to a series of violent conflicts would be to betray its deeper meaning. It was also a profound awakening of individual conscience. In the conviction that every person should read and interpret the Bible for themselves, there lay the seed of modernity. The affirmation of freedom of thought, personal responsibility, and the inalienable dignity of the individual. Although still far from modern notions of religious tolerance, the fact that multiple churches, interpretations, and creeds now existed, sometimes in brutal rivalry, opened an irreversible path toward future pluralism. The Catholic Church, shaken but not defeated, responded with the Counter-Reformation, a vast movement of spiritual, administrative, and doctrinal renewal. The Council of Trent, the founding of new orders like the Jesuits, and the emotive power of Baroque art were all part of a vigorous response that not only checked the spread of Protestantism but revitalized Catholicism from within. Yet the world had already changed. The collapse of Europe's religious unity had far-reaching consequences. The relationship between secular and ecclesiastical power shifted. New national identities emerged, grounded not solely in loyalty to Rome but also in allegiance to local churches and communities. Politics, culture, and economy, all were shaken by the reverberations of the Reformation. Education, for instance, expanded dramatically. The imperative for every believer to read Scripture fostered the creation of schools, universities, and printing presses even in remote areas. The notion of widespread literacy and intellectual formation found a powerful ally in the Reformers, though they could scarcely have foreseen the revolutionary consequences their insistence on education would one day unleash. Likewise, the Reformation contributed to the development of a work ethic and a sense of daily responsibility that, according to scholars like Max Weber, would help pave the way for modern capitalism. The idea that diligent labor and the careful stewardship of time and resources could be expressions of divine calling infused entire societies, leaving deep cultural marks far beyond theology. Yet the Reformation also brought immense suffering. It was war, exile, persecution. It was intolerance pitted against intolerance, violence answering violence. In its name, works of art were destroyed, books were banned, heretics were burned, and radical movements dreaming of even deeper reforms, more egalitarian, more inclusive, were mercilessly crushed. The yearning for purity, the desire to return to the sources, often descended into new dogmas, new divisions, new tragedies. Perhaps that is why, when we look back at the Reformation, we see not a simple heroic saga, but a tempest of light and darkness, of spiritual elevation and human fallibility. A tempest that wounded Europe deeply, yet opened doors that could never again be closed. Today, when we step into ancient cathedrals transformed into Protestant churches, when we read the Bible in our mother tongues, when we affirm the right to believe or not to believe, we are, knowingly or not, echoing that spiritual revolution that helped forge the modern world. The Protestant Reformation was not merely a rebellion against the Church, nor simply a theological quarrel with Rome. It was a bold affirmation that faith belongs, also, to the intimate dialogue between each soul and the divine, that truth must be sought even at the risk of error. At its heart, it was an immense call for freedom, dignity, and responsibility. A flame born from the anguish and passion of a German monk, spreading like an inextinguishable fire, lighting paths that humanity still dares to walk today. The Age of Enlightenment. There was a moment, between the dim twilight of dogma and the growing hunger for knowledge, when humanity decided that reason would no longer be its enemy, but its most powerful ally. A profound shift, almost imperceptible at first, yet within a few decades it transformed how people thought, governed, and dreamed. This moment, born in the salons of Paris, the libraries of London, and the cafés of Vienna, was the Enlightenment. The era when the light of human understanding rose to dispel the darkness of ignorance, superstition, and absolutism. The Enlightenment was not a homogeneous movement, nor a closed manifesto, but rather a web of ideas, intuitions, and intellectual struggles that, despite their differences, shared one unshakable conviction: faith in the power of reason. Thinkers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, Kant, Montesquieu, and Hume wove a network of reflections that touched almost every sphere of life: politics, education, science, morality, and art. Each, from their unique perspective, contributed to a grand symphony that proclaimed the world could be understood, and therefore improved. It was a time when ideas traveled with the speed of book caravans, where every café, printing house, and aristocratic salon became a forum for debate and exchange. The encyclopedias, those monumental works that sought to compile all human knowledge into organized, accessible volumes, were not only symbols but acts of faith in the perfectibility of understanding. In their entries on science, politics, and theology, pulsed the conviction that education is emancipation, that knowledge is liberation, and that thinking itself is a revolutionary act. Criticism of the old absolutist regimes, of hierarchies based on blood or tradition, rose with irresistible force. Montesquieu, in his Spirit of the Laws, proposed that power must be divided and balanced to prevent despotism. Rousseau, in his Social Contract, dreamed of a community of free and equal citizens, where sovereignty truly resided in the people. Voltaire, with his sharp pen, attacked dogma and tyranny with equal fervor. Each, from their trench, helped to undermine the foundations of an order built on blind obedience and inherited privilege. Science, liberated from the shackles of dogma, flourished as never before. Newton had shown that the universe obeyed precise mathematical laws, and this mechanistic vision became both metaphor and method for the age. Observation, experimentation, and logical reasoning displaced the authority of tradition. Lavoisier's chemistry, Herschel's astronomy, Linnaeus's biology. In every scientific advance, the spirit of the Enlightenment resonated, the certainty that the world was a book written in the language of reason, waiting to be read. Education, long the privilege of a chosen few, became a central cause. Philosophers like Locke proposed that the human mind was not born with innate ideas but rather as a blank slate, shaped through experience and learning. Schools, teachers, and books became powerful weapons in the quiet but determined battle against ignorance, and the foundation for a new citizenry of critical, independent thinkers. The Enlightenment also redefined the relationship between the individual and power. With new language and new vigor, rights were proclaimed that had previously seemed almost unimaginable. The right to life, to liberty, to property, to the pursuit of happiness. Concepts such as religious tolerance, freedom of the press, and the right to a fair trial emerged. Born in philosophical treatises and academic discussions, these ideas would soon find a more turbulent life in public squares and on revolutionary battlefields. Yet not everything in the Enlightenment was pure clarity. In its zeal for reason, it sometimes overlooked the emotional complexity of human nature. In its enthusiasm for universality, it sometimes ignored cultural diversity, local traditions, and the multiplicity of human voices. The ideal of a perfectly rational and orderly humanity would later collide painfully with the realities of passion, conflict, and irrationality that reside deep within the human heart. The French Revolution, the most dazzling child of the Enlightenment, would demonstrate that reason itself, when turned into dogma, can become as ruthless as the superstitions it sought to replace. Nevertheless, the legacy of the Enlightenment remains vast and profound. It laid the foundations for modern democracies, for declarations of human rights, for public education systems, for scientific academies, for republican constitutions. It taught that doubt is a duty, that debate is a virtue, and that the relentless pursuit of truth is an indispensable engine of civilization. Today, when we defend freedom of thought, when we demand transparency from governments, when we affirm the intrinsic and inalienable dignity of every human being, we are still breathing the air that the Enlightenment thinkers unleashed. Not as a closed inheritance, but as an ongoing project, a permanent invitation to think, to question, to learn. The Enlightenment was not merely a chapter in history books. It was a promise that light, however fragile and wavering, can carve a path through the densest darkness. A promise that humankind, armed with reason, empathy, and courage, can aspire not to perfection, but to a fairer, freer, more conscious life. And it is this still vibrant promise that reminds us that to think, to question, and to seek are not neutral acts but profoundly human, profoundly revolutionary, and profoundly necessary gestures. The French Revolution. In the summer of 1789, the world as Europe knew it began to collapse with a roar that would echo for centuries. It was not a natural disaster nor a foreign invasion, but an internal eruption, a convulsion that sprang from the very heart of France and, fueled by hunger, inequality, and a thirst for justice, set fire not only to palaces and churches but also to ideas, principles, and the most entrenched certainties. The French Revolution was not merely a revolt. It was a political, social, and cultural earthquake that forever changed how people understood themselves, their relationship to power, and their aspirations for freedom. For decades, the Ancien regime had upheld a structure based on privilege. Clergy and nobility enjoyed tax exemptions and almost untouchable rights, while the Third Estate, peasants, artisans, and the burgeoning bourgeoisie bore the weight of taxation and injustice alone. It was an ancient edifice, held together more by the inertia of tradition than by the legitimacy of its foundations. When the bad harvests of 1787 and 1788 struck a country already ruined financially, the structure began to creak audibly, and the French people, until then patient, started to ask whether they should continue bearing a burden neither God nor nature had ordained. Amid this unbearable tension, the convocation of the Estates General in May 1789, intended as a solution to the crisis, became the catalyst for a far deeper transformation. The assertion that the Third Estate, the vast, silent majority, represented the true nation was like a spark falling on parched earth, igniting the revolutionary fire. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, was not merely the liberation of a few prisoners. It was the unleashing of a popular force that no established authority could contain. From its inception, the revolution was a tumultuous symphony of passions, ideals, and contradictions. Liberty, equality, fraternity. These words, which today resonate with almost mythical purity, were then cries of war, banners of hope, and justifications for violence. Symbols of the old order were toppled. Feudal rights were abolished. New principles were proclaimed, shaking the foundations of all Europe. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, approved in August 1789, remains one of the boldest and most luminous documents ever written. In it, the human being, simply by existing, was recognized as the bearer of inalienable rights. But, as with all forces born from pain and hope, the revolution soon exceeded the bounds of moderation. What had begun as an affirmation of principles quickly turned into a fierce struggle for survival, ideological purity, and power. The monarchy fell to the guillotine. Louis XVI, timid and clumsy, was judged and executed, not so much for his actions as for what he represented. Blood ran in the streets, and the revolution devoured, one after another, its own children. Moderates, radicals, Girondins, Jacobins, all were consumed by the unstoppable maelstrom. The figure of Robespierre, the incorruptible, embodies the paradox of the revolution. His fierce commitment to virtue and liberty ultimately led him to justify ruthless repression in the name of those same ideals. The Reign of Terror, between 1793 and 1794, sowed fear even among the most ardent revolutionaries. The guillotine, intended as a symbol of swift and impartial justice, became the dark emblem of a revolution that, in its effort to purify itself, nearly destroyed itself. Yet, it would be a grave mistake to see in the revolution only violence, chaos, and excesses. For amidst the tumult, profound changes germinated that would shape the modern world. The idea of popular sovereignty, the affirmation of universal rights, the notion of active citizenship, these were no longer the exclusive patrimony of philosophers. They had become embodied in the people, in the streets, in the armies that defended the revolution against the monarchies allied to restore the old order. The French Revolution also opened new spaces for debates long suppressed. Women, although still denied full citizenship, began to organize, to claim their place in the public sphere, to draft their own declarations of rights. The question of abolishing slavery, though approached with contradictions and limitations, began to occupy political agendas. The dream of a free, equal, and fraternal humanity, though imperfect, gained a new urgency and gravity. As time passed, the revolution evolved into new forms. The meteoric rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, from general of the Republic to emperor, represented both a culmination and a transformation of the revolution. Under his rule, many revolutionary reforms, the civil code, centralized administration, equality before the law were consolidated, yet at the same time, a new concentration of power and military glory emerged. The revolution had opened a door that could not be closed, but not all its promises were fulfilled immediately or evenly. Today, when we speak of human rights, democracy, and equality before the law, we are still breathing the air that those revolutionaries of 1789, through blood and tears, infused into the world. Not because the French Revolution was perfect. It was, in many respects, a whirlwind of contradictions, of heroic generosity and brutal cruelty, but because it opened a horizon of possibility, a space where politics ceased to be the privilege of a few and became the responsibility of all. The revolution reminds us that great transformations are never linear or peaceful, that real change demands sacrifice, rupture, and scars. But it also teaches that once human dignity is awakened, it cannot be permanently crushed without leaving indelible marks on those who attempt it. It shows that liberty, equality, and fraternity are not states to be reached once and for all, but perpetual tasks, fragile conquests that each generation must renew, defend, and rethink. Perhaps this is the deepest legacy of 1789. Not a closed set of achievements, but an unquenchable impulse, a call to vigilance, to courage, to hope. A reminder that a people who recognize their sovereignty can change not only their institutions but also their destiny. The American Civil War. In the mid-19th century, at the heart of a young nation that had proclaimed liberty as its founding ideal, a deep fissure began to tear apart the very foundations on which it had been built. The United States, the boldest democratic experiment of its time, suddenly found itself confronted with its own most painful contradictions. The promise of equality collided brutally with the persistent reality of slavery, and the Union, so proudly defended, threatened to fracture under the weight of irreconcilable interests, values, and visions. The American Civil War was not merely a conflict between North and South. It was a battle for the soul of a nation, a struggle over territories, but, more profoundly, over the very definition of freedom and humanity. From its very beginnings, the history of the United States was marked by ambivalence. Even as it proclaimed the inalienable rights of all men, millions were held in bondage. For decades, the country grew and prospered, but with each expansion westward, with every political debate and economic compromise, the unresolved question of slavery continued to fester. Every new state admitted to the Union reignited the same anguished debate. Would it be a free or a slave state? The division, though geographical in appearance, was in truth a moral wound that ran through the entire body of the Republic. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 acted as a catalyst for a process that had become unstoppable. Though moderate in his early pronouncements, Lincoln was seen by many Southerners as an existential threat to their way of life, built on slavery. In a swift and determined movement, 11 Southern states decided to secede from the Union and form the Confederate States of America. The break, initially accomplished without bloodshed, seemed irreversible. But Lincoln, firmly convinced that the Union must be preserved at all costs, refused to recognize the legitimacy of secession. When, in April 1861, Confederate troops fired upon Fort Sumter, war became inevitable. What many had imagined would be a brief and contained conflict quickly transformed into a total war, one that would claim the lives of more than 600,000 Americans. Each battlefield, Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, became a stage of sacrifice and horror, where hopes of victory and the brutal reality of carnage intertwined inseparably. The Civil War was not just a military confrontation but a clash of two worlds. The South, rural, agrarian, and tradition-bound, fought to preserve a way of life rooted in slavery and rigid hierarchies. The North, more urbanized, industrialized, and open to waves of immigration and the transformations of modern capitalism, saw itself, though not without its own contradictions, as the defender of freedom and universal citizenship. Abraham Lincoln emerged during the conflict as a figure of almost mythic stature. Politically astute and morally driven, he gradually transformed the initial aim of the war, from preserving the Union, into something far greater, the abolition of slavery as a necessary condition for true peace. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 did not immediately free all slaves, but it marked a point of no return. The fight was no longer solely for unity. It was for the radical redefinition of the nation's founding principles. Every soldier, every grieving mother, every fugitive slave risking their life to cross into Union lines was part of a collective drama of immense proportions. The war raged not only on the battlefields but also in hearts and consciences, in churches, in newspapers, in fiery speeches, and in the silent moments of deepest sorrow. The course of the war was long and bloody. After years of bitter fighting, of advances and retreats, of victories and devastating defeats, Union forces under generals like Ulysses S. Grant slowly managed to break the Confederacy's resistance. The surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox in April 1865 sealed the North's victory, but the wounds left open by the conflict would take far longer to heal. Just days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater, a single act that seemed to distill the accumulated bitterness of the war into one fatal moment. His death turned Lincoln into a martyr, and his figure, already towering, ascended into legend. The task of rebuilding a divided nation and integrating millions of newly freed citizens into a society that continued to view them with hostility fell to successors less visionary and less capable of maintaining the delicate balance of justice and reconciliation that Lincoln had envisioned. The post-war period, known as Reconstruction, was a time of both hope and profound disillusionment. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, granting citizenship, and protecting the right to vote, respectively, seemed at first to mark major victories. Yet racism, violence, segregation, and the South's stubborn resistance to the new order undermined many of these gains. The war had ended, but the struggle for true equality had only just begun. Today, more than 150 years later, the echoes of the Civil War still resonate within American society. Debates about race, citizenship, historical memory, and civil rights all find their roots in that titanic conflict. Statues, flags, street names, and schools bear witness to a history that is not a straightforward march to perfection, but a continuous struggle between noble ideals and persistent shadows. The American Civil War teaches us that nations are not born fully formed, but are forged through conflict, sacrifice, and painful choices. It shows that freedom is not a passive gift, but a hard-won, fragile achievement, always under threat. It reminds us that justice must be defended not only in lofty speeches but in law, in action, and in the daily engagement of an active citizenry. Above all, it teaches that true unity is not enforced by the sword but built upon a sincere commitment to the principles of dignity, equality, and liberty. Principles that, despite countless betrayals, continue to shine like distant, unextinguished stars on the horizon of history. The Industrial Revolution. There came a moment when the murmur of the fields gave way to the roar of machines, when the ancient rhythm of the seasons was replaced by the pulse of steam and iron, when sleepy villages transformed into bustling cities, devouring men and dreams alike. This moment, which began in the late 18th century on the green lands of England and soon spread like an unstoppable fire across Europe, America, and beyond, was the Industrial Revolution. A transformation so profound and radical that it marked the true beginning of the modern era in every conceivable sense. Before factories dotted the horizons with smoking chimneys, most humans lived bound to the land, tied by tradition, subsistence, and a fatalism that left little room for hope. Time was still the time of the sky, of rain, of harvest, of the eternal return of nature's cycles. Life was short, hard, and monotonous, and the chances of escaping the conditions of birth were slim. Yet, in the dimness of small workshops, in the quiet experiments of anonymous inventors, in the daring calculations of visionary entrepreneurs, a metamorphosis was beginning, one that would forever alter humanity's relationship to work and to matter itself. The invention of the steam engine by James Watt, perfecting earlier designs, was one of those sparks that set ablaze the dry grass of an innovation-hungry Europe. For the first time, human or animal muscle was no longer necessary to power wheels, levers, and hammers. Steam, that invisible and mighty creature, became the engine of a new world. Textile factories, the first to harness this new force, multiplied their output unimaginably, lowering costs, expanding markets, creating fortunes, and unprecedented exploitation. The social landscape was transformed at breathtaking speed. Millions of peasants abandoned their villages, drawn or pushed toward industrial cities where work was plentiful but conditions were brutal. Entire neighborhoods sprang up overnight, made of red brick and muddy streets, where smoke darkened the sky and hope mingled with despair. Here, the modern worker was born. Anonymous, expendable, subjected to endless shifts in factories where the roar of machines was as deafening as the indifference of those who profited from their labor. The Industrial Revolution was not only an economic or technological revolution, it was, above all, an existential one. Time, once cyclical, became linear, productive, measurable. The clock, once a tool of monks and scholars, became the silent master of factories and lives. Work ceased to be a natural extension of life and became a duty, a commodity to be bought and sold. And with this transformation came new forms of alienation, poverty, and exclusion, but also new possibilities for mobility, education, and progress. Capital, concentrated in the hands of a few, reshaped the social structure of industrialized nations. A new class emerged, the industrial bourgeoisie, proud of its success and its power to reshape the world to its image. Opposed to it stood the proletariat, increasingly aware of its numerical strength and shared vulnerability. The first strikes, the first unions, the first socialist utopias were born as responses to a system that, in its quest for productivity and profit, had forgotten the basic needs of those who sustained it. The Industrial Revolution also transformed transportation. The railroad, that iron snake winding across fields and mountains, connected regions, shortened distances once thought insurmountable, created national markets, and transformed trade on an unprecedented scale. The ability to move rapidly, to link cities and ports, did not merely energize economies. It fundamentally altered human perceptions of space and time. The locomotive was not just a machine. It was a symbol. Humanity was no longer confined by the limits of feet or village boundaries. Science and technology did not halt but became permanent allies of industry. Each new necessity generated an invention. Each invention bred new necessities. Chemistry discovered new materials. Metallurgy refined its techniques. Medicine began, albeit hesitantly, to extend life expectancy in overcrowded cities, even as hygienic conditions remained disastrous. Progress, this magical word, became a near-religious ideal, a promise of future redemption in exchange for present sacrifices. Yet, the Industrial Revolution was neither uniform nor just. While some regions transformed into industrial powerhouses, Others remained mired in agricultural backwardness or were reduced to mere suppliers of raw materials for the new global economy. Colonial exploitation intensified, adopting new economic forms while perpetuating old hierarchies under the guise of technical progress. The world became more interconnected than ever before, but not more equitable. On the human level, the Industrial Revolution left an ambiguous legacy. It created wealth, but also extreme poverty. It opened opportunities, but often at the cost of uprooting and exploitation. It broadened access to education and social mobility, but it also widened the gaps between those who enjoyed the fruits of progress and those who merely survived at its margins. It inspired dreams of emancipation, but also nightmares of dehumanized futures dominated by soulless factories and machines. The artists and writers of the era captured this ambiguity with sensitivity. Dickens, in his novels, chronicled the misery and injustice of industrial cities. The Impressionists painted the anonymity and vibrancy of the new urban masses. Early labor movements dreamed of a world where technology would be a tool of liberation rather than oppression. Today, looking back, we see in the Industrial Revolution not just the beginning of modernity, but also the origin of the major challenges we still face. Structural inequality, environmental degradation, the tension between economic growth and human well-being. Understanding that great historical upheaval is not an exercise in nostalgia but a pressing necessity to understand the paths we choose today. The Industrial Revolution reminds us that change, once unleashed, is unstoppable, dizzying, and deeply ambiguous. It teaches that human ingenuity, capable of creating wonders, can also generate monsters if it forgets the face of the other. Pushes us to ask, what kind of progress do we want to build? One that liberates or one that enslaves? One that humanizes or one that reduces life to numbers and commodities? For if there is one enduring lesson from that revolution of steam and iron, of smoke and hope, it is this: the future is not pre-written. Every technological advance carries an ethical question. Every machine built is also a mirror in which we must seek our own humanity. The First World War. There was a time, not so long ago, when Europe, dazzled by its own brilliance, believed that technological progress, cultural wealth, and calculated diplomacy would suffice to prevent the catastrophes that had devastated earlier generations. A beautiful illusion, nourished in the cafés of Paris, on the boulevards of Vienna, in the clubs of London. An illusion built on vast empires, gleaming armies, and blind confidence that civilization itself was an invulnerable shield. Yet a single shot in Sarajevo, a nearly anonymous act of violence, was enough to tear through that veil of certainty and plunge the world into a war whose dimensions and horrors no one could have imagined. The First World War did not erupt suddenly or inevitably, but once unleashed, it became unstoppable. Europe was a powder keg of secret alliances, colonial rivalries, inflamed nationalism, and mutual fears. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914 was merely the spark that ignited the dry underbrush. Within weeks, the great powers were drawn into a chain reaction that neither reason, appeals, nor fear could stop. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, France, Britain, and soon many others, plunged into a war they expected to be brief and almost honorable, unaware they were inaugurating an era of industrialized slaughter. From the outset, the war took on a new and devastating form. The old battles of maneuvers and heroic cavalry charges gave way to endless trenches, barbed wire, and landscapes devastated into muddy wastelands where life was reduced to a desperate wait between bombardments. Places like Verdun, the Somme, and Ypres became synonymous with hell on earth, where heroism and absurdity were indistinguishable, and mere survival became the ultimate form of resistance. Technology, once the symbol of progress, revealed its darkest face. Machine guns that could mow down entire regiments in minutes, poison gas that suffocated bodies and hopes alike, artillery with monstrous range that made the earth tremble for days. Science had put itself at the service of mass destruction. The airplane, originally a symbol of adventure, became a tool of surveillance and bombing. The submarine carried war to commercial shipping routes, spreading hunger and fear far beyond the trenches. It seemed as if all of humanity's inventiveness had been redirected toward the art of killing. But the war was not fought only on the battlefields. In factories, in hospitals, in homes on the home front, millions mobilized their efforts. Women, stepping into roles in production, medicine, and administration, broke traditional gender barriers and opened social cracks that would not be easily closed. The state exerted unprecedented control over daily life. Censorship, propaganda, rationing, conscription. The ideal of the autonomous liberal citizen crumbled under the weight of total war. With each passing month, each passing year, the initial enthusiasm eroded. Patriotic songs rang hollow against the endless casualties, the futile offensives, the mountains of wounded and dead. In soldiers' letters, in nurses' diaries, in poets' desperate verses, one senses the growing realization that they were trapped in an absurd, inhuman machinery. And yet the war dragged on. New fronts opened. In the east, where the vast but fragile Russian Empire faltered. In the Middle East, where the Ottoman Empire disintegrated. In Africa and Asia, where European wars became truly global. The entry of the United States in 1917, with fresh troops and industrial might, gave the exhausted Allies new momentum, but it also prolonged the suffering. When the armistice was finally signed on November 11, 1918, Europe did not erupt in jubilation but fell into stunned silence. The losses were too great, the wounds too deep, the cost was immeasurable. Over 10 million dead, countless wounded and maimed, devastated economies, fallen empires. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire all collapsed or were radically transformed. Borders were redrawn, often arbitrarily, sowing seeds for future conflicts. The peace treaties, especially the Treaty of Versailles, did little to heal the wounds. In many cases, they deepened them. Perhaps the deepest loss was psychological. Faith in progress, reason, and the inherent superiority of European civilization lay shattered. Literature, art, and philosophy between the wars breathed this disillusionment. Existentialism, surrealism, modernism were all attempts to give form to a historical experience that had shown the fragility of everything once thought solid. The First World War also left behind bitter lessons. That modern societies, no matter how educated and sophisticated they might seem, could descend into barbarism. That technology without a deep ethical compass could become a weapon against humanity itself. That patriotism without critical reflection could breed monsters rather than heroes. Today, when we recall the trenches, the destroyed villages, the lost generation, we do so not merely to remember a bloody chapter of history. We do so to acknowledge that peace is not a natural state, but a fragile achievement requiring constant vigilance, wisdom, and courage. The First World War was not only the end of an era, it was the somber prelude to a century marked by doubt, by desperate searches for meaning, and by the painful realization that human ingenuity can create wonders, but also devastation. And in the earthquake that shook Europe and the world back then, there still echoes a warning we would be wise never to forget. The Russian Revolution. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire stood like a colossal structure frozen in time, a giant resting on crumbling pillars, unable to bend to the winds of change sweeping across Europe. Beneath the sumptuous facade of the imperial palaces, a wounded nation pulsed. Peasants still tilling the land as they had centuries before, workers enduring endless shifts in inhuman factories, soldiers fighting wars they neither understood nor desired. Russia was, in many ways, a monumental anachronism, and within it, tensions were brewing that could no longer be contained. Tsar Nicholas II, the last of a centuries-old dynasty, ruled with a blend of stubbornness and detachment. Unable to grasp the magnitude of the social and political upheavals shaking his empire, he saw every protest as a personal threat and responded with repression or indifference. The reforms reluctantly promised after the Revolution of 1905 quickly dissolved into a sea of bureaucracy and corruption. The Duma, a nominal parliament, was little more than a powerless instrument. Meanwhile, the ferment of discontent grew invisibly and inexorably in factories, barracks, and villages alike. When World War I broke out, Russia plunged into the conflict with patriotic fervor, but soon found itself spiraling into humiliating defeats, unbearable privations, and senseless sacrifices. The front lines collapsed, cities starved, soldiers deserted en masse. Tsarism, already weakened, found its death sentence in the war. The old state machinery, incapable of sustaining both the war effort and the survival of its people, crumbled before everyone's eyes. In February 1917, Petrograd, the imperial winter capital, erupted in spontaneous protest. It was not the result of a plotted conspiracy or professional revolutionary maneuver, but a chaotic uprising of workers, women, and ordinary soldiers demanding bread, peace, and dignity. The army, traditionally the monarchy's support, refused to fire on the demonstrators. Nicholas II abdicated, an act both belated and futile. For a brief moment, Russia seemed poised on the threshold of a democratic future. The provisional government, hastily formed by liberal and moderate forces, tried to govern a country already falling apart. Its insistence on continuing the war, its inability to address the agrarian crisis, and its growing disconnection from the masses quickly eroded its legitimacy. In factories, regiments, and villages, Soviets, councils of workers, peasants, and soldiers, rose to challenge the government's authority. Into this vacuum stepped the Bolsheviks, led with iron discipline by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. With their simple and devastating slogan, "Peace, bread, and land," they captured the exhausted and desperate spirit of the people. Lenin, with acute political instinct, understood that there was no time for gradual reform. The revolution had to be immediate, radical, and total. Thus, in October 1917, amid the thunder of a few cannon shots and with relatively little bloodshed, the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government and seized power in the name of the Soviets. The October Revolution was not the end but the beginning of a long and brutal transformation. Immediately, Lenin and his circle faced enormous challenges: civil war, foreign invasions, economic collapse, and widespread popular resistance. The new state, born under the promise of all power to the Soviets, quickly concentrated authority in the hands of the Communist Party, in the name of defending the revolution and the anticipated global uprising. War communism, with its forced grain requisitions, ruthless purges of opponents, and militarization of civil life, saved the Bolshevik regime from defeat but at a terrible price. Millions died from famine, violence, or disease. The initial hope for a more just society was drowned in a maelstrom of terror, hunger, and repression. The civil war between the Red Army and the various white, monarchist, and nationalist forces further devastated the already exhausted country. Amid the catastrophe, Lenin pragmatically introduced the new economic policy, NEP, in 1921, a partial return to capitalism that allowed for modest economic recovery. Yet the foundations of absolute party rule had already been firmly laid. After Lenin's death in 1924, a fierce power struggle ensued, from which Joseph Stalin emerged as the unchallenged leader, pushing the revolutionary project into unprecedented heights of totalitarianism and brutality. The Russian Revolution left an indelible mark far beyond its borders. It inspired revolutionary movements in Europe, Asia, and Latin America, polarized entire societies between admirers and bitter enemies of communism, and forever altered the relationship between the individual and the state, between idealism and power. It revealed both the immense power of organized masses and the terrible dangers of messianic leadership. Symbolically, the Russian Revolution embodied both the dream and the nightmare of the 20th century. The dream of a world free from exploitation, hunger, and humiliation, and the nightmare of gulags, systematic repression, and ideological terror. It was an epic of genuine hopes and brutal betrayals, of heroic sacrifice and unspeakable crimes. Today, more than a century later, contemplating the Russian Revolution forces us to confront the eternal dilemma of history: how to reconcile the thirst for justice with the preservation of human dignity, how to transform the world without betraying it anew. For in that red October, not only did an empire fall, but a question was born that still resonates. How far are we willing to go to build a different future? The Second World War and the Holocaust. There was a time when horror shattered the boundaries of human imagination, when evil took on forms so systematic, so cold, and so vast that they forever changed the meaning of inhumanity. This time was the Second World War, a catastrophe that not only devastated countries and peoples but tore apart the conscience of humanity itself. Between 1939 and 1945, The entire world was plunged into a conflict that turned the earth into a field of ruins and the skies into domains of death, where each victory seemed to cost an irreplaceable piece of hope. The rise of Adolf Hitler to power in Germany in 1933 marked the beginning of an unstoppable process. Exploiting national humiliation after the First World War, economic crises, deep-seated fears, and resentments, Hitler built a totalitarian regime that sought not only to restore German pride, but to violently reshape the world order. Nazism, with its cult of strength, its visceral racism, and its utter contempt for life beyond the Aryan ideal, unleashed a machinery of conquest and extermination unprecedented in human history. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 ignited the spark of war. France and Britain, honoring their commitments, declared war on Germany. But the conflict, far from being contained, spread like wildfire. Within months, much of Western Europe fell under Nazi rule. Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and finally France succumbed to the Blitzkrieg's devastating force. Only Britain, isolated yet defiant, resisted, sustained by the unbreakable will of its people and the determined leadership of Winston Churchill. Meanwhile, in the East, Stalin and Hitler, temporarily allied through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, divided Poland and the Baltic states between them. Yet the alliance was fragile, merely a tactical pause in Hitler's expansive ambitions. In 1941, Operation Barbarossa opened the Eastern Front, the largest and bloodiest confrontation in history. Russia, caught between ice and fire, would suffer incalculable losses but would forge, in places like Stalingrad and Kursk, the beginnings of the Reich's downfall. Beyond armies and epic battles, the Second World War was also, and perhaps above all, a war against civilians. Entire cities were obliterated. Populations were displaced, starved, and bombed. And amid this widespread horror emerged the Holocaust, the systematic attempt to annihilate the Jewish people of Europe, along with other groups deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. The Holocaust was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence, but a deliberate, coldly planned policy. From the Nuremberg laws stripping Jews of basic rights, to the ghettos like Warsaw, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, the process was methodical, relentless, almost industrial. Day after day, trains carried men, women, and children to places where death was the only certainty. The numbers are staggering. 6 million Jews murdered, along with millions of Roma, homosexuals, disabled individuals, Soviet POWs, and political dissidents. But beyond numbers, it is the systematization of the crime that horrifies, the cold bureaucracy, the participation, active or passive, of so many. In the testimonies of survivors, in the documents left behind by the perpetrators, there echoes an unbearable truth: that civilization itself, even at its most refined, is no safeguard against barbarism. In the Pacific, Japan pursued its own brutal imperial ambitions. The rape of Nanking, the use of forced labor, inhumane experiments, and the military occupation of vast Asian territories formed a parallel history of horror. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 fully brought the United States into the war, making it a truly global conflict. The war spread across continents, covering the globe with battlefields: Africa, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Pacific. Every Allied victory was dearly bought. Every gain exacted painful sacrifice. Names like El Alamein, Midway, and Normandy evoke not just triumph, but also the immense tragedy of a humanity caught in its own cycle of destruction. In 1945, the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of its crimes and defeats. Berlin fell. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. The world held its breath at the extent of the revealed devastation. Yet the war did not truly end until August, when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Acts that killed tens of thousands instantly and left indelible scars on humanity's moral landscape. The Second World War left behind a world in ruins. Shattered cities, displaced peoples, fractured memories. The creation of the United Nations was a desperate attempt to prevent future catastrophes. The Nuremberg trials marked the first serious effort to hold war crimes accountable as offenses against all humanity. But the wounds ran deep, and humanity entered the Cold War era carrying the indelible scars of that monstrous conflict. Today, we remember the Second World War not just to honor the dead or to celebrate victories, We remember to recognize that barbarism is not an accident, but a latent possibility in every society. We remember to understand that peace is fragile, that human dignity must be defended daily, and that memory is a sacred duty. The Second World War and the Holocaust left behind an unshakable warning that civilization, however advanced, does not guarantee goodness, that technical progress can coexist with moral collapse, that hatred, once unleashed, can drag entire worlds into the abyss. That warning still echoes in our time, a bell that must never stop ringing. The decolonization of Africa and Asia. There was a time when vast stretches of land, from the deserts of Africa to the jungles of Southeast Asia, were marked on maps in foreign colors, crossed by straight lines that ignored mountains, rivers, cultures, and dreams alike. A time when entire nations were treated as property, their resources extracted, their voices silenced, their peoples reduced to invisible subjects under flags that were not their own. This era of colonial rule, which had reached its height in the 19th century, began to crumble irreversibly in the 20th century, giving rise to one of the deepest movements of emancipation in human history, the decolonization of Africa and Asia. The process was neither immediate nor uniform nor painless. It was a long, tumultuous birth, full of contradictions, hope, and bloodshed. And although many factors drove decolonization, the exhaustion of colonial powers after World War II, the pressure of nationalist movements, the global shift in ideas about the right to self-determination, at its heart pulsed a universal human aspiration, the longing for freedom, dignity, and sovereignty. World War II had left Europe physically, morally, and economically weakened. Empires that for centuries had presented themselves as invincible suddenly realized they could no longer sustain the burden of their overseas possessions. Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and others faced the colossal task of rebuilding their own countries, while in the colonies, generations were coming of age who no longer accepted subjugation as an inevitable fate. Promises of freedom made during the war, often to recruit colonial soldiers, now became urgent demands. In Asia, the process took shape rapidly and decisively. India, the jewel of the British Empire, led the way. Under the leadership of figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, the Indian independence movement combined nonviolent resistance with remarkable political skill. After years of marches, strikes, imprisonments, and sacrifices, India gained independence in 1947, though at a heavy price. The partition of the territory into India and Pakistan unleashed one of the bloodiest migrations in modern history. India's success sparked a fire that could not be extinguished. In Indonesia, after a brief Japanese occupation during the war, nationalists led by Sukarno and Hatta proclaimed independence in 1945, facing a bloody struggle against the Dutch that ended in 1949. Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh, embarked on its own long battle against French domination, a conflict that would sow the seeds of even greater tragedy in the decades to come. In Africa, the awakening was just as profound, though often more fragmented. Ghana, under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, became the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to achieve independence in 1957, opening a path for many others. In Algeria, the fight against French rule was particularly brutal, a war of liberation that left deep scars on both societies and redefined the very notion of national identity. Each country followed its own path. Some, like Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser, sought to assert their sovereignty through profound reforms and a policy of non-alignment. Others, like Congo, plunged into civil wars, foreign interventions, and persistent crises. The end of colonial rule did not mean the end of difficulties. Artificial borders drawn by colonial powers, lack of infrastructure, Western-educated elites, and external economic interests complicated the dream of true self-determination. Yet, despite these challenges, decolonization represented an immense moral victory. For the first time in centuries, colonized peoples asserted their place as active subjects of history rather than passive objects of conquest. Nations long dismissed as backward or incapable of self-rule demonstrated organizational capacity, resilience, and visionary leadership. The Bandung Conference of 1955, where leaders from Asia and Africa met to chart a common path, stood as a potent symbol of this new global awareness. Not all decolonization processes were peaceful. In Kenya, The Mau Mau uprising revealed the ferocity of a struggle where colonial brutality met desperate resistance. In South Africa, the end of British colonialism left intact a system of racial segregation that would require decades more of struggle to dismantle. In many cases, political independence did not translate into economic independence, and new forms of dependency, often more subtle, emerged under the guise of aid, trade, and diplomacy. Decolonization also transformed the international architecture. The appearance of dozens of new states in the United Nations shifted power dynamics, giving voice to regions that had long been silenced. South-South solidarity movements, non-aligned alliances, and attempts to forge a fairer world order bore witness to a new global consciousness. Though these dreams often collided with the harsh realities of the Cold War, internal rivalries, and external interventions. Today, more than half a century after those waves of independence, the legacy of decolonization remains deeply ambivalent. There are stories of success, of growth, of cultural and political affirmation. There are also tragedies of endless wars, authoritarian regimes, and persistent poverty. Yet underlying all of them lies a fundamental achievement: the recovery of dignity, the right to choose one's own destiny, for better or worse. The decolonization of Africa and Asia was not a mere geopolitical adjustment. It was a profound revolution in humanity's self-conception. It signaled the recognition that there are no superior races, no cultures predestined to rule, that the diversity of human experience is a treasure, not a hierarchy. And it was, ultimately, a radical affirmation that every form of oppression, however deep-rooted it may seem, can be resisted, that all domination, however absolute, can be overturned. Perhaps today, in a world still grappling with the open wounds of colonialism, in economic inequality, in structural racism, in cultural tensions, it is more important than ever to remember that time of rupture and hope, because decolonization was not just a fact of the past. It remains an unfinished project, a task that each generation must take up anew if it hopes to build a truly free, truly human future. The Civil Rights Movement in the United States. In the years following World War II, as the world celebrated the defeat of fascism and dreamed of a new order based on human dignity, vast regions of the southern United States remained trapped in a system of segregation and oppression. Millions of citizens were systematically denied their most basic rights, simply because of the color of their skin. On the streets, in schools, in public spaces, separation was visible, brutally normalized, and sustained not only by law but also by a deeply ingrained culture of hatred and fear. The civil rights movement did not arise suddenly, nor was it a spontaneous reaction. It was the mature fruit of decades of silent struggles, of communities that, despite systematic exclusion, had kept the flame of dignity and resistance alive. Since the days of Reconstruction, brave men and women had fought against Jim Crow laws and everyday discrimination, building networks of solidarity in churches, unions, and neighborhoods, laying the foundation for what was to come. Within this tense atmosphere, certain figures emerged as beacons of hope. Martin Luther King Jr., a young pastor with a calm yet powerful voice, embodied the strategy of nonviolent resistance, inspired by Christianity and the teachings of Gandhi. His ability to turn suffering into a moral call and daily humiliation into a universal demand for justice reached not only the hearts of those who suffered but also the hearts of those who had remained indifferent. The spark that ignited the mass movement was small but of immense significance. Rosa Parks, a seamstress from Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus to a white passenger. Her arrest led to a year-long bus boycott, organized by King and sustained by thousands of ordinary people who walked for miles every day. This boycott proved that change was possible, through collective courage, without violence, through the quiet insistence on dignity. Yet the path toward equality was accompanied by brutal violence. Peaceful demonstrators were attacked by police dogs, knocked down with fire hoses, and suffocated with tear gas. Churches were bombed, activists were murdered, families terrorized by night raids. Still, or perhaps precisely because of such cruelty, the movement gained moral strength and captured the attention of the nation and the world. Each demonstration, each sit-in, each boycott was a declaration of humanity against a system that questioned the very right to exist. The March on Washington in 1963, where King delivered his historic "I Have a Dream" speech, was not just a political event. It was a collective affirmation that the ideals of liberty and equality belonged not to a single race but to all of humanity. Legal victories eventually followed, though none came without sacrifice. In 1954, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed racial discrimination in public spaces and workplaces, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 guaranteed African Americans access to the ballot box. These achievements were monumental, but dismantling centuries of institutional racism could not be accomplished overnight. The civil rights movement tore deep wounds into the national consciousness, forcing the United States to confront its own contradictions between its noble ideals and its brutal realities. It was not merely about changing laws but about transforming awareness, about making justice a lived, daily experience. Behind the prominent leaders stood thousands of invisible heroes. Housewives who organized boycotts, students who risked arrest, workers who donated from their meager wages, rural citizens who braved threats to register to vote. The true engine of change was the collective action of countless ordinary people. By the late 1960s, the movement had become more complex. While many continued to advocate for nonviolence, others, especially among younger activists, grew impatient. Groups like the Black Panther Party preached self-defense and called for a radical restructuring of society. The civil rights movement was never monolithic. It reflected the diversity of experiences and strategies within an oppressed people. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 did not mark the end of the struggle but revealed how deep the wounds still ran. Economic inequality, police brutality, and covert forms of segregation remained painful realities. The movement had opened doors, but the road to true equality stretched far beyond. Today, it is tempting to view the civil rights movement as a closed chapter. Yet the battles for civil rights continue to pulse through every struggle for fair education, for housing access, for political representation, for dignity. The spirit of the movement lives on in all those who, even now, insist that justice must be more than a promise. The civil rights movement in the United States was more than a sequence of laws passed or memorable speeches delivered. It was a profound moral awakening. It was a painful and luminous reminder that history does not bend toward justice on its own, that progress is the result of human courage, endurance, and hope. Each generation must pick up that thread again to ensure it does not break. Ultimately, the dream of freedom and equality that moved those brave men and women belongs not to a single country, race, or era. It is a universal legacy, a flame that continues to burn wherever someone dares to proclaim that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The fall of the Berlin Wall. Berlin, a city divided in two, stood for nearly 3 decades as the most tangible symbol of the Cold War, the dividing line of a world fractured by irreconcilable ideologies. In its streets, between separated neighbors and watchful eyes, the wall rose, a scar of concrete, a barrier not only physical but emotional and spiritual, encapsulating fear, distrust, and oppression. Its fall, in November 1989, was not merely the collapse of a structure. It was the opening of a wound towards hope, the crumbling of a century seemingly condemned to eternal division. When the government of the German Democratic Republic decided to build the wall in 1961, it did so with the desperation of a system feeling it was losing control. For years, thousands had fled from east to west, seeking freedoms denied to them, opportunities forbidden, air that felt lighter and freer. The construction was abrupt, almost grotesquely improvised, but its effect was immediate. Berlin was sliced apart like a fruit cut clumsily with a knife, and the lives of its people became filled with absences too permanent to mend. The wall was more than concrete and barbed wire. It was the physical manifestation of a world divided into two visions of humanity and society. On one side, the East, where the state permeated every aspect of life and the individual existed to serve a collective project often confused with submission. On the other, the West, with its promises of freedom, consumption, and democracy, not without contradictions, yet shrouded in the irresistible aura of the forbidden. Each crack in the wall, each desperate escape attempt, Each bullet fired at a fleeing soul was a brutal reminder that the division was not merely political but deeply existential. For years, the wall seemed invulnerable, guarded by watchtowers, soldiers with orders to shoot, electrified fences, and minefields. It became the stage for a tragic absurdity where attempts at freedom were paid for with life itself. And yet history moves at rhythms that no surveillance can stop. In the East, life under the heel of the state slowly eroded loyalty, building an invisible but profound weariness. Scarcity, censorship, and lack of hope accumulated like small stones in the pockets of a society destined eventually to sink under its own weight. The 1980s brought changes at first imperceptible, then irreversible. With Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in the Soviet Union and his policies of perestroika and glasnost, the balance of fear that had preserved the Eastern Bloc was disrupted. Gorbachev could not and would not maintain the status quo through violence, leaving Eastern European leaders dangerously exposed to their own people's growing dissatisfaction. In East Germany, signs of change multiplied. Peaceful demonstrations began to fill the streets, at first timidly, then with unstoppable momentum. Leipzig became a center of this silent but powerful protest. Ordinary citizens, armed only with candles and determination, demanded an end to repression. Each step taken into the public squares was a defiance of fear, an uprising of dignity against oppression. On November 9, 1989, the unthinkable happened. In a chaotic press conference, a government spokesperson, through confusion and poorly chosen words, announced that citizens of East Germany could immediately cross into the West. The message spread like wildfire. Thousands rushed to the border crossings, not to ask for permission, but to claim their long-denied freedom. Bewildered guards, lacking clear orders and the traditional backing of violent enforcement, finally opened the gates. That night, people climbed atop the wall. They danced, they cried, they embraced strangers as brothers and sisters reunited. The wall, that symbol of oppression, fell not through the might of tanks or bombs but through the collective will of a hopeful people. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a geopolitical event of the highest order, but it was above all an emotional triumph, an explosive outburst of joy that resonated far beyond Germany. It showed that history is not shaped solely by the decisions of leaders but also by the persistent dreams of millions. It revealed that even the most massive structures crumble when hollowed out from within. The reunification of Germany was neither automatic nor without tensions. Two societies that had evolved differently for decades faced the challenge of knitting themselves together. A long, difficult process filled with misunderstandings, economic disparities, and cultural unfamiliarity. Yet the mere fact that they attempted unity not through conquest but through historical necessity spoke to a collective maturity once thought impossible. Beyond its political and economic consequences, the fall of the wall left a vast symbolic legacy. It reminded the world that the hardest borders are not the ones built with concrete, but those constructed in minds and hearts. That physical barriers are mere reflections of deeper divisions that must be healed for genuine change to endure. It taught that lasting transformations are rarely born from grand gestures, but from countless small acts of everyday courage. Today, fragments of the Berlin Wall stand around the world, in museums, in public squares, as relics of a dark era and monuments to the possibility of change. And though new walls, both visible and invisible, have arisen, the image of that November night remains alive. People, armed only with hammers and hope, tearing down the symbol of their own oppression. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not just a moment frozen in time. It was a renewed promise that history, despite all its shadows, can still be written in the ink of hope. The arrival of humans on the moon. Since the dawn of time, the moon had inhabited humanity's dreams, myths, and songs. A silver lantern suspended in the night sky, unreachable and mysterious, a silent witness to the evolution of civilizations. For centuries, cultures revered it as a goddess, an omen, a mirror of hopes and fears, without imagining that one day, so close in the cosmic scale of time, humans in white suits would leave their footprints upon its dusty surface. The arrival of humans on the moon in July 1969 was far more than a technological triumph. It was a profound affirmation of our ability to dream boldly and reach for what once seemed impossible. The space race had been born out of fierce rivalry. The United States and the Soviet Union, locked in the ideological contest of the Cold War, extended their competition to the stars. The Soviet Union made the first move with the launch of Sputnik in 1957 and with Yuri Gagarin's historic first orbit around the Earth in 1961. For the United States, these Soviet victories were not only technical defeats but deep symbolic wounds. It was in this climate that President John F. Kennedy issued his bold challenge: to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. What followed was an epic feat of human endeavor. A collaborative symphony of engineers, scientists, mathematicians, pilots, technicians, and dreamers of every kind. The Apollo program became the spearhead of an enterprise that demanded not only innovation and precision but also courage in the face of the unknown. Every test, every launch, every failure cost resources, time, and sometimes lives, but each step brought humanity closer to that distant horizon. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 lifted off from Cape Canaveral, an expedition that had once seemed pure fantasy. On board were Neil Armstrong, Edwin "Buzz" Aldrin, and Michael Collins, three men carrying not only perfect training but also the hopes of an entire planet. The flight, appearing almost effortless from the outside, was in reality a continuous dance of exact calculations, assumed risks, and steady bravery. After nearly 4 days in space, the lunar module, Eagle, separated from the command module and began its precarious descent to the surface. In the final minutes, alarms blared. Fuel reserves dropped dangerously low. Armstrong, with extraordinary calm, took manual control to avoid a lethal boulder field. Finally, when the lander's feet touched down on the Sea of Tranquility, Armstrong announced, "The Eagle has landed," sending a surge of emotion through Houston's control room and millions of homes worldwide. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon's surface and uttered the famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." In that moment, the boundary between Earth and cosmos, between dream and reality, dissolved, if only for an instant. Buzz Aldrin followed shortly after, describing the scene as magnificent desolation. The two spent a few precious hours collecting samples, setting up scientific instruments, and planting the American flag, not as a symbol of conquest but as a testament to the collective human spirit that had made this achievement possible. Meanwhile, Michael Collins orbited alone around the moon, a silent reminder that even in humanity's greatest moments, solitude is never far away. The live broadcast of the moon landing reached over 600 million people, an unprecedented number in media history. For the first time, humanity shared a collective moment of awe, a moment that transcended nations, languages, and ideologies. That night, the moon was no longer a distant, silent companion. It was a place we had reached. Yet the triumph was not without contradictions. Wars, injustices, and poverty still raged on Earth. The United States was mired in the Vietnam War and internal crises. Many questioned how billions could be spent on space exploration while people starved back home. Yet the impulse that had driven humanity to the moon was not one of cold rationality. It was born of the same restless curiosity, the same yearning for expansion, that gains even more meaning in dark times. The return journey was another masterpiece. Armstrong and Aldrin launched from the lunar surface in the Eagle's ascent stage, docked with Collins in the command module, and together they embarked on the long voyage home, through a cosmos that remained both awe-inspiring and deadly. On July 24, 1969, the capsule safely splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, concluding a journey that had spanned 8 days and an entire era. The moon landing did more than open new scientific vistas. It expanded humanity's collective self-understanding. It proved that we are not bound to Earth, that dreams, no matter how impossible they may seem, can become reality through determination, knowledge, and bravery. Today, when we look up at the night sky, we know that there, in the silent expanse of the Sea of Tranquility, human footprints remain, witnesses to a night when humanity dared to redefine itself. The flag planted in the lunar soil still stands, bleached and battered by cosmic radiation, a silent echo of the moment when we first truly touched the stars. Apollo 11 was a celebration of human imagination, a tribute to the capacity to grow beyond limitations. Yet it was also a reminder. Every conquest brings new questions, new responsibilities, to our planet, to future generations, and to the vast universe we have only begun to explore. The arrival of humans on the moon remains one of the greatest chapters in our history, a mirror reflecting our vulnerability, our boldness, and our insatiable longing for new horizons. For if anything defines humanity beyond its flaws and contradictions, it is the eternal impulse to look farther and ask, what lies beyond? The digital age and the birth of the internet. At the close of the 20th century, a profound, silent, and omnipresent change began weaving a new reality. A mutation in the very way human beings interact, learn, create, and remember. It did not come with thunderous noise or bloody revolutions, but as an invisible web, gradually infiltrating every corner of life. The arrival of the digital age and the birth of the internet were not mere technological advances. They marked the opening of a new mental landscape, the beginning of a metamorphosis that even now, in its early stages, is reshaping the very meaning of what it is to be human. The seeds of this transformation were sown in the midst of the Cold War, in military laboratories and universities seeking to develop communication systems resilient to nuclear attack. In 1969, the same year humanity first set foot on the moon, a group of scientists in the United States connected 4 computers, creating ARPANET, the first sketch of what would eventually become the Internet. At that time, no one could have foreseen the world-altering consequences of that modest technical experiment. During the 1970s, this new interconnected world quietly began to grow. Protocols were developed to allow different machines to speak a common language. Over time, TCP/IP was born, the backbone upon which the entire structure of the Internet would rise. Gradually, a network took shape, still confined to academic and military circles, where documents could be shared, messages sent across great distances in seconds, and invisible communities began to form, though few were yet aware of it. The true explosion came with the invention of the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee in the late 1980s. With the creation of a system of hypertext accessible through browsers, the Internet transformed from a labyrinth of technical complexities into a space accessible to the general public. The first web pages appeared, the first search engines, the first slow, noisy home connections, humble beginnings that hinted at a monumental shift. The 1990s became a time of discovery and expansion. Companies like Netscape, Yahoo, and later Google emerged to organize the burgeoning chaos of information. Vast digital libraries, discussion forums, chat rooms, and early e-commerce ventures began reshaping entire sectors of the economy and culture. It was an era of almost naive enthusiasm, where the Internet was seen as a virgin land full of promise. Democratization of knowledge, borderless freedom of expression, a platform where all technological dreams seemed possible. Yet the digital revolution did not stop at the flow of information. Simultaneously, a deeper transformation was unfolding, the birth of the data age. Every interaction, every click, every search left a trace. A small puzzle piece that, when assembled, painted a detailed portrait of desires, habits, and emotions. Companies and governments soon realized that power no longer resided only in the control of territories or natural resources, but increasingly in the ability to collect, analyze, and utilize information. Thus was born the invisible architecture of the data economy, subtly but profoundly governing daily life. The advent of social networks in the early 21st century accelerated this transformation dramatically. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and other digital spaces reshaped human relationships, tearing down geographic barriers while redefining identity, intimacy, and public discourse. In a few short years, life online ceased to be an adjunct and became an inseparable extension of reality. Friendships, social movements, news all began to flow, at least in part, through algorithmic mediation. The digital age brought paradoxes that are still difficult to fully grasp. Never before had there been such access to knowledge, such immediacy in communication, such opportunity for individual expression. And yet, phenomena of isolation, social fragmentation, and massive manipulation through information bubbles and echo chambers also arose. The early dream of an open, democratic space now coexists uneasily with surveillance, corporate monopolies, and digital inequalities that often mirror and sometimes deepen the fractures of the physical world. The internet has been a catalyst for radical change across every domain: education, medicine, art, politics. It has enabled scientific collaborations across continents, amplified marginalized voices, and challenged authoritarian regimes. But it has also served as a vehicle for new forms of control, the spread of disinformation, and addictive consumption patterns exploiting human vulnerabilities. Like all profound revolutions, the digital revolution is ambivalent. It is neither wholly good nor wholly bad. It is a mirror reflecting humanity's greatness and flaws alike. It offers tools for intellectual emancipation but tempts us toward comfort and superficiality. Connects us as never before, yet sometimes at the cost of true emotional closeness. Today, more than half a century after that first connection between four computers, the digital world is inseparable from the physical one. Artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and quantum computing herald new transformations whose reach we can scarcely predict. We live in a time where the boundary between natural and artificial is blurring, where memories are stored in invisible clouds, and where identities increasingly form in digital spaces. Where this transformation will lead remains uncertain. The Internet, like every tool, is as constructive or destructive as we make it. It can be a platform for global citizenship and critical thinking, or a labyrinth of illusions, disinformation, and division. The digital age is still young. Its story has only begun to be written, yet it has undeniably altered the very ground on which we build our lives. Screens open windows to the world, and can just as easily become cages. Our voices have multiplied, yet sometimes it seems we listen less. The birth of the internet and the spread of digital technologies have granted humanity an unprecedented power. The power to continuously redraw the boundaries of knowledge, communication, and imagination. But they also remind us, with their dizzying speed, that technology alone cannot solve the essential dilemmas of human existence. The true challenge of our time is not merely to use digital tools, but to wield them with wisdom, empathy, and critical thought. Because ultimately, beyond algorithms, high-speed connections, and virtual worlds, we remain what we dream, what we build together, what we share heart to heart. The digital age will not abolish our humanity. It will test it as never before. If any of these moments caught your interest, I invite you to leave a comment. Which story impacted you the most? Your voice adds to this shared exploration of past and future. Thank you for being here.